folks. We're going to talk about the spinal cord and spinal nerves in this presentation. Um, I'm going to break up this presentation into two separate videos. This one's going to be about spinal cord anatomy specifically, and then the second presentation we'll talk about what we call the plexuses and the associated nerves. We're also going to define what rami are in that second presentation. So let's go for it, right? Spinal cord. Basically, you think of the spinal cord as the superhighway traveled by afferent signals up the spinal cord, so ascending through the spinal cord to the brain. So that's for sensation. And then motor, which is efferent signaling down or descending through the spinal cord, headed for spinal nerves and out to effectors. And of course, effectors are going to be either muscles or glands. Spinal cord is really important, so it's going to be protected, of course. And what it's protected by, of course, is the bones of the vertebrae. When we talk about the spinal cord, we're not talking about the bones. We're talking about the bundles of nerves, the tracts, and the associated nerves and glial cells that are within that bundle of tissue, not the bones itself. Okay, so spinal cord refers to the nervous tissue, not the bone. But of course, it's within the bony vertebrae, and it's also covered by some connective tissue, which is some really tough layers of membrane, and those membranes are known as the meninges. Each individual one is a meninx, which is a really hard word to say for me. I don't know, maybe it's a hard word for you to say too. Going from superficial to deep, dura mater is the most superficial of those meningeal layers. The arachnoid layer comes after that, and then the pia mater is after that. So those three are the three layers of meningeal protection, of course, and then that's going to be deep relative to the bone itself. Look at the spinal cord in cross-section. Now, this would be a transverse section. You see that this spinal cord has like sort of a brownish, light brownish area. This is white matter, and this is gray matter, although it looks kind of light brown and dark brown. That's because of the stain and the preservative, fixative material, the formaldehyde that this specimen was preserved in. If you look at where the spinal cord is in relationship to this vertebrae, this would be the anterior part of the vertebrae. This would be the posterior part of the vertebrae. This is that dorsal spine, and these are these transverse processes on the back side or the posterior dorsal side of the vertebrae. And of course, within that vertebrae is housed the spinal cord. When you look at a spinal cord like this isn't really a superior view or a posterior or anterior view. It's sort of superior and anterior. You can see that the spinal cord has these nerve roots that are attached to it laterally. And I want you to pay attention to these arrows here. This arrow, see how it's pointing in to the spinal cord? And this arrow is pointing out or away from the spinal cord. That should give you an idea of the direction of the sensory signaling as well as the motor signaling. The sensory signaling pathway is back into the back posterior of the spinal cord, and the motor signaling is out the anterior. This is another look at a preserved specimen. This is a dissected cadaver, and you're looking at it from the posterior view. So what that means is that this part of the bony vertebrae has been all dissected away. This is some of those vertebrae that have been cut. So some student or perhaps a doctor doing an autopsy for some reason, or some medical professional basically used a saw to cut away the posterior portion of the vertebrae to expose the spinal cord for either learning inspection or perhaps autopsy inspection. This is another view of the spinal cord, but this is anterior, as you can see down at the bottom of the screen. So this would be the cervical area of the spinal cord. You can see that these are the rootlets that are emanating from the anterior of the spinal cord. So test yourself right now. Are those going to be motor neurons or are those going to be sensory neurons? What do you think? Check your notes. Make sure you know, okay? This view would have had to involve dissection away of all of the trachea and the esophagus, and of course the bony part of the vertebrae, which is called the body of the vertebrae, to expose this to make it visible. This is another view of the spinal cord, and what you're also seeing here is the base of the brain, region of the brain called the cerebellum. That That's the part of the brain that coordinates a lot of your body movements and your sort of perception of where your body's place in space is. The spinal cord is continuous with the brainstem, and if we're going to talk about where the spinal cord begins and where the brain ends, really we define that border, if you will, as the opening of the skull, which is called the foramen magnum. That's that big opening in the bottom of the skull. So the spinal cord begins where the skull ends, essentially, and then of course we're seeing more of the spinal cord and the little roots, or the rootlets as they're called, that are attached to the posterior. Now this is a posterior view of the spinal cord in the back of the brain. And this is still part of the skull that's intact. Or maybe that's dura. It's hard for me to tell. Dura mater, that meningeal layer. The dura covers the brain as well as the spinal cord, just FYI. I like this diagram because it defines where the sensory nerve roots are and where the motor nerve roots are. Defines for you what this ganglion is. You'll notice that a ganglion is sort of a bulging area. All right. Of course, a sensory nerve root means that the sensation pathway signaling is going back into the spinal cord. And then, of course, this is a motor nerve root, so that means that there's signaling going out to either muscles or glands, depending on where the spinal cord is, these nerves are destined for. This bulge right here is that ganglion, and of course, that's as it's defined, as a cluster of nerve cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. Of course, the spinal cord is part of the central nervous system. These nerves out here are technically peripheral nerves, so that's part of the PNS, or the peripheral nervous system. I like this diagram too because it shows you the relative positioning of the three meninges. The dura, of course, is most superficial. The pia mater is deepest and in direct contact with the spinal cord itself. When we look at the spinal cord as a whole, so you look at this sort of cartoonist representation, again, we're going to say that it's beginning at the foramen magnum, and it's not a continuous sort of tube-like structure. You'll notice that there are some enlargements here in the cervical area and the lumbar area, and then it actually ends at sort of like a cone-like tip at around the L2 vertebrae, right? That cone-like tip is called the conus medullaris. And then what continues inferior to that are cauda equina. This word cauda here, also here, all right, is it means tail, and equina, of course, refers to equus, which is the genus name for horses. So I guess somebody, when they first dissected this out, thought that the inferior end of the spinal cord looked like horsetail hairs. And it kind of does. It's not like a one continuous tube here. There are these individual fibers that continue down and eventually emanate out through the posterior openings, these little foramen in the sacrum. There is a central filament, as it's called, and of course the word filament is fancy for string, that descends down in the midline of the spinal cord and eventually ends at the coccyx. And there is one coccygeal nerve here that ends up emanating out of the region of the body, the coccyx region. So this is a picture of where the conus medullaris is. So this spinal cord is sort of this intact tube up here, and the conus medullaris comes down to this tip, cone-like tip here, and then the terminal filament, or the thulium terminal, if we're going to say it in Latin, descends down the rest of the way, and these are all these horsetail like hair structures named, of course, cauda equina. This is this tough dura mater that's been reflected, so obviously all this can be seen. Interestingly enough, when a procedure called an epidural, this is a procedure that an anesthesiologist would perform to block pain inferior to the injection site. And this, of course, is helpful to a mom that's delivering a baby, because baby exiting out through mom is a painful process, and so this is a pain blocking or a pain control procedure that's done. And essentially what expecting mom does is sort of curls her back like this, and an anesthesiologist very carefully inserts a needle between the spiny dorsal spines in the lower region of the lumbar area, and wants to get it in the epidural region. So epi means above the dura. The needle should not penetrate below and through the dura. Essentially, anesthesiologists can do this by feel. Of course, it takes a lot of practice, and it's a very, very refined skill. If we look at the number of those nerves that emanate laterally from the spine, we have a total of 31 segments, and they emanate both from the right and the left side of the spinal cord. There are 8 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal nerve. So if you add all that up, 8 plus 12 plus 5 plus 5 plus 1, it's 31. In many cases, the number of nerves is equivalent to the number of bones. That's not the case for the cervical region here. There's actually a nerve that emanates over the top or the superior region of the C1 vertebrae and then one below the C1 vertebrae. So C1 nerve is sitting superior to the C1 atlas vertebrae, and C2 emanates out inferior to that C1, and so on and so forth. The C8 nerve emanates inferior to the C7 vertebrae or superior to the T1 vertebrae. And then everything else is sort of named relative to the bones themselves. But remember, the sacrum is one bone, but there are 5 nerves that emanate out of it laterally typically, and then 1 coccygeal nerve. It's also important to note that the cross-section of the spinal cord doesn't look the same all the time, so the shape and the arrangement of the gray matter and white matter isn't always consistent. So I would ask you to just note that. It's just an interesting feature. And we're going to, in the next presentations, talk about what's going on in the white matter versus the gray matter here, and actually coming up in the next slides here too. I'd ask you to recall too that a nerve, when we talk about a nerve itself, it's not just one cell, it's actually a bundle of neurons, or rather a bundle of neurons. And this is a relatively simple diagram showing you how the groups are organized, and then the names of the various membranous material that covers the varying sort of levels of organization within the nerve. You might recall that these prefixes, peri, endo, and epi, they're used to describe the levels of membrane that encapsulate and cover various levels of organization of muscle cells too, right? So instead of paramycin, we're talking about paraneurium, epineurium, also out here, and then endoneurium, which really is basically the same stuff as the myelin material from those glial cells that are producing the myelin that, of course, allows for saltatory conduction, which is a faster rate of signaling from one end of a neuron to the other end of a neuron. Let's talk about what white matter is versus gray matter. When you're looking at white matter in either the brain or the spinal cord, what you're looking at is neurons that have myelin, all right? And that's the region of the neuron where generally the cell body isn't. And that myelin doesn't really have a lot of stuff in it. The axons don't really have a lot of stuff in it. It's basically just ions flipping in and out of those regions of the cell. There's not a lot of cell parts, no organelles in that region. Most of that stuff, the dense part of neurons, is going to be in the cell bodies. And the cell bodies and the dendrites of neurons are not myelinated. And so the denser part of these cells and the collection of these cell bodies or unmyelinated axons, they look kind of darker. So this is how and why there is white matter and how and why there is gray matter. You might be asking how it can be that some of the neurons in our spinal cord can be unmyelinated and not have saltatory conduction. Well, there's a reason why they can get away with that, and we'll be talking about that when we discuss reflex arcs. This is a little bit of a general anatomy. If we look at naming regions of the cross section of a spinal cord, excuse me, the parts of the gray matter, it kind of looks like a butterfly, kind of looks like an H, have names, right? And so the gray matter, these regions out here are called horns, all right? And they have names, right? We've got posterior, we've got lateral, we've got anterior. And then this commissure, this word commissure, what that means is communication. What that allows for is signaling from one side of the body over to the other side of the body. Now, there's a white commissure too. There's white matter area here where that communication is possible. The white regions of the white matter, these regions of the white matter, they're called funiculi. So the funiculus is the singular, funiculi is the plural. And they're named for essentially their location, posterior, lateral, and anterior. Um, there is a groove here called the sulcus, and then there's an anterior median fissure here. And this is a place where there's a important blood vessel that lies in this fissure. Um, we don't actually have blood moving into. There's no blood circulation inside the spinal cord, so there's no blood vessels in here. Getting nutrient molecules and waste molecules to and from the neurons in these regions of this anatomy really depends on what's called cerebrospinal fluid. And there's going to be cerebrospinal fluid flowing all around this spinal cord and actually within it in this central canal. This is another look at it, and this diagram has more um, structures labeled. And I want to point out this over here, right? Again, this is going to be a nerve sensation, so this is, of course, afferent, and this is showing you the direction of signaling for a motor neuron. And what you'll notice is that there is, in some cases, some direct connections between a sensory neuron and a motor neuron. And what this is going to allow for is a reflex, so your body can respond to some painful or very strong stimulus before your brain even can register really what it is. So we'll talk about that in terms of reflexes in a moment, or actually probably in another presentation. I just ask that you take a look at these diagrams and just, look at them, right? Know in general what parts are where and what they're named. This is what a spinal cord really looks like. So this is a cross section of a spinal cord, and this has been stained. Real tissue doesn't look as beautiful as it does in those cartoonish graphic artist representations. Um, and of course, this purple is not a natural color. It's been stained to help you visualize what's going on with this. This includes, of course, the white matter up here. You can tell that this is the posterior, and there's the sulcus would be there, although it's hard to see. This is the anterior down here, so that fissure would be here. This thick sort of pinkish layer is the dura mater. That's really, really thick and tough. Here's one of those ganglions where there'd be a collection of nerve cell bodies. And when something like this is sliced, sometimes the connections are sort of deformed and broken when the slicing process happens. So it's not a perfect and intact cross section of the spinal cord, but hopefully you get the idea. All right, so I want you to know some of these terms. This is a good, oops, I went too far. Oh, let me back up here. So ganglion, that's a term, of course, that's a collection of cell bodies. In the brain and in the spinal cord, though, if you have a collection of cell bodies, it's referred to as a nucleus. We'll talk more about nucleus centers in the brain in the next chapter. A tract, of course, is a bundle of neurons, right? So you've got, many nerves sort of bundled together in what's called a tract. And the ascending ones, of course, that's signaling back up to the brain, so that's sensory. And descending ones coming from the brain, so that's going to be motor or efferent signaling. Okay? And then, of course, you should correlate posterior and anterior, the location of those nerve roots or nerve rootlets, with that signaling pathway direction. All right? Here's another look at some of the spinal cord cross sections with some labels for you to take a look at. You can pause this and study this a little bit. But I think what's most important on this diagram is this part here. So we've got this blue and the pink area of the spinal cord. I mean, I just roughly want you to know where in the spinal cord the ascending or the sensory pathways are, where the descending or the motor pathways are. And what you'll notice is that most of the descending pathways correlate with where the anterior, this would be the anterior side, by the way, this is the posterior side up here in this diagram. Most of the ascending tracts are posterior and lateral, although there's some exceptions, of course, here. And most of the descending, which is motor signaling pathways, that's going to be mostly anterior. Okay? If you really want to know more names for these tracts and where they are and what they're doing, this is a nice diagram to look at. And of course, you watched that video on spinal tract anatomy and you made your own drawing, hopefully. In a high school level anatomy class, I'm not going to require that you remember where the interfascicular semilunar fasciculus is. I'm not going to worry about that level of detail. When you're studying to be a neurosurgeon, Yeah, you might want to know that, right? But not right now, okay? Just giving you an idea that these pathways and these tracks have been named and mapped. And I think that's it for this presentation. Hopefully you learned something. Thank you.